name is Chelsea and welcome to my channel. This week I'm going to be discussing my very first attempt at making baby blankets and burp cloths. I made this first batch for a couple of friends of mine who recently had newborns, and there was a lot of trial and error in figuring out how to make these blankets and burp cloths. But overall I'm pretty happy with the results, and yeah, I'm excited to share with you what I learned. So let's get to it. So I started out with a lot of nursery flannel, one for each side. I decided to do two different patterns. And then for the blankets, I decided to trim it with piping. I used a couple layers of terry cloth inside the burp cloths for extra absorbency. And because regular detergent can be a little too harsh on newborns, I used a special newborn detergent to pre-shrink everything. Here you can see I'm putting the piping in a bag so that it doesn't get tangled up in the machine. And I ran everything on a warm cycle to make sure that make sure any shrinkage that was going to happen happened. And then ran everything in the dryer. I made the mistake of not getting it in the dryer right away, so it wrinkled a little bit and I had to sit there and iron all the fabric out. If I'd got it into the dryer a little bit sooner and then folded up the fabric right away, it would have reduced wrinkles by quite a bit. I trimmed all the frayed edges on the flannel and all the selvage so I could accurately fold the fabric to get a square using the triangle method, where you fold it into a triangle and that gives you a perfect square that way. And here, I'm using pinking shears to do all the cutting so that the fabric doesn't fray as much. As you can see here, I have two squares of two different prints. One square for each print, I should say, from front and back. And I laid it out on a large surface, which happened to be my bed in this case. Here you see I am laying out the piping. I ended up using 2 packages of piping for each blanket, which meant that one package wasn't quite long enough, so I ended up attaching the 2 pieces to make one long piece of piping off camera, and I didn't do a very good job. I'll have to try again to get it right. Here you can see I'm laying the piping between the 2 layers so that it'll show up on the right side of the seam. And here you can see I clipped the piping so that it will go around the corner nicely. Hello, Editing Chelsea here, and I realized in the process of editing this video that I forgot to film the actual making of the blanket following putting the piping into the blanket, following pinning the piping between the 2 pieces of flannel. I filmed this sporadically over the course of several months between a couple of other projects, and I forgot to show you guys how I actually put it together. So where we last left off, the piping was being put between the 2 pieces of flannel, right side to right side, and I sewed around the blanket on the wrong side as close to the piping as possible, except for a few inches so I could turn it right side out. I clipped the corners so that it's not too thick here. It's nice and easy to sew down flat. And once I turned it right side out and I ironed it, I top stitched as close as possible to the piping here, and then another row of stitches down below to just make it a little bit more secure. By top stitching as close to the piping as possible, I didn't have to hand whip the opening closed. I just had to make sure all the raw ends were tucked in carefully and pinned or clipped in such a way that the raw edges didn't pop out, and then top stitched it right next to the piping. So that's one way of doing it if you don't want to hand whip it together. But if you don't plan to top stitch the blankets, you have to hand whip the opening close. So what I did was I folded the blanket in third, like so, and then in thirds again, and that forms little corners in the fabric here, little folds here, and I put a pin in each one, and then I unfolded it, took it over to the machine, and if you can see here, I zigzagged back and forth a few times so that when the blanket gets put into the wash and it inevitably shrinks a little bit more, the two layers aren't too distorted. So that's essentially how I actually sewed the blanket together. Okay, burp cloths. Alright, the burp cloths were definitely a lot of trial and error. It took a lot of experimenting. I ended up using 2 pieces of terry cloth and 2 pieces of flannel, front and a back, same as the blankets. And I tried various ways of stacking it so that the terry cloth was on the inside and the flannel was on the outside when turned right side out. And the best way I found was to put the flannels right side together and then sandwich it between the terry cloth so that it just ended up distributing the fullness of the seam allowance a lot more evenly that way. So I'm using sewing clips at this point. I had upgraded from pins to sewing clips. And unlike the blankets, I actually have footage of me sewing the burp cloths together. So as you can see here, I'm just sewing all the way around, and I'm going to leave a couple inches to turn the burp cloth inside out. And yeah, here you can see where I left an opening. It ended up being a little too tight to get the whole thing pulled out, so I ended up using my seam ripper to open up the hole just a tiny bit. And then I clipped all the corners, just made sure I didn't cut over where I had sewn, and trimmed any excess terry cloth to make sure the seam allowance was as small as possible once I turned it right side out. And here my burp cloth is doing the equivalent of, I don't know about you, but to me it kind of looks like a caterpillar turning into a chrysalis just a tiny bit. And I used a chopstick to poke the corners out to make them look as neat and as sharp as possible here. And you can see here there's the raw edges from the opening where I turned everything right side out. So I just fold down the raw edges, make sure that they're not going anywhere, and I use my clips to hold it in place, and then I take it back over to the machine and I top stitch pretty close to the edge, but not right on the edge, starting at the opening to make sure it's fully closed, and then I sew a top stitch all the way around to kind of anchor down the seam allowance and to just give it a kind of a finished look. Sewing 2 diagonal lines on the burp cloths, and the reason for that is the same reason I did the zigzag stitches on the baby blanket. It's partly to keep it from distorting when it gets in the wash, and partly because there were so many layers and the terry cloth threatened to shift around, so having the long diagonal stitches kept everybody from moving around, and gave it a really cool quilted feature. And now that I have all the completed baby blankets and burp cloths, it's time to package them up in such a way that I could present them to their intended recipients. Or in this case, I actually ended up shipping them, so I'm packing them up to put into the gift bags. And then I ended up packing up the gift bags in shipping boxes and sending them to the respective recipients. And I decided to try and roll up the blankets, and so I could fold in such a way that I could fold down the corners so you could see the two prints that so you can see that they're double-sided. And I'm fussing around here because I wanted them to roll a certain way. There we go, everything folded and ready for assembly into the gift bags. And that was how I made my first batch of baby blankets and burp cloths. I'm really happy with the design of the burp cloths. They fit nicely over the shoulder, and because they're double-sided flannel, it doesn't matter which side is up, the baby's face will always be on something soft. And double layered terry cloth means it's super absorbent. And I love how cute these blankets came out. I love the details I put into it with the piping and the top stitching, and I love the double print. I look forward to mixing and matching more prints in the future. I figured out if I have 3 yards of one print and 3 yards of a second print, that makes approximately 2 double-sided blankets and 4 double-sided burp cloths. I don't know how much terry cloth that is exactly. I just have a whole bunch of terry cloth and I just cut it to size for the burp cloths, so I'll have to measure it next time to see how much terry cloth it takes. I look forward to making more baby blankets and experimenting with the different prints, and possibly even making my own binding to see if I can get some more color options, some more design options. I had a lot of fun on this project, and I hope you enjoyed coming along on this adventure with me. If you like this video, please consider subscribing to my channel, and if you want to be notified about when new videos are released, hit that notification bell. Thank you so much for watching. Stay whimsical, and I'll see you all next week. Bye!